Grace pressed her back against the wooden door, heart hammering as gunshots erupted outside her farmhouse. In her arms, baby Thomas whimpered against her chest, while Sam's blood soaked through the bandages she'd carefully wrapped weeks ago. "They found us," he whispered, checking his revolver with shaking hands. She looked down at the child who had become everything to her, then at the man who had brought them both salvation and danger, knowing that in the next few minutes she would either become a mother or lose everything she'd learned to love again. Grace Whitaker pressed her weathered hands against the kitchen table, staring at the single plate she'd set for dinner. 28 years old, and already felt ancient. The silence in her farmhouse stretched like pulled taffy, thick and endless. 6 months since tuberculosis took Henry away. 6 months of talking to chickens and pretending the echo of her own voice counted as conversation. Her daily routine had become a prison of predictability. Feed the chickens at dawn. Tend the vegetable garden. Avoid the nursery upstairs at all costs. That room stayed locked tighter than a banker's vault, holding memories of the baby she'd lost 2 years back. Some wounds never stopped bleeding. They just learned to bleed quieter. The storm hit just as Grace finished her beans and cornbread. Thunder cracked overhead like God himself was splitting firewood. Rain hammered the roof with the fury of a revival preacher condemning sin. She'd barely cleared her dish when desperate pounding shook her front door. Nobody visited Grace anymore. Neighbors had their own troubles, and she'd grown tired of their pitying looks anyway. The pounding came again, more frantic this time. Through the door came a sound that stopped her heart cold. A baby's cry, thin and desperate as winter wind. Grace threw open the door without thinking twice. A man collapsed against her doorframe, blood soaking through his shirt, rain streaming down his face. But what made her gasp wasn't his condition. It was the tiny bundle clutched in his arms. A baby, maybe 3 months old, wailing like his little heart might break. "Please," the stranger gasped, his voice raw as sandpaper. "The baby. He needs milk. Been days since—" The man's legs buckled. Grace caught him by the elbow, shocked at how light he felt. Death had a weight to it, and this man carried that burden heavy on his shoulders. "I'm Sam Turner," he whispered, pressing the baby into her arms. "Outlaws killed my Sarah during a bank job gone wrong. Been running ever since. This here's Thomas." The baby's cries pierced right through Grace's chest, unlocking something she'd kept buried for months. Her body responded before her mind caught up. Milk came flooding back as she held Thomas close, her arms remembering what they'd been made for. "You're burning up with fever," she told Sam, helping him stumble toward Henry's old study. The irony wasn't lost on her. Another dying man in her house. Another chance to fail at saving someone. But this time felt different. This time came with tiny fingers that gripped her thumb like salvation itself. Sam collapsed onto the makeshift bed she arranged, muttering about gang members and narrow escapes. His story had holes bigger than Swiss cheese, but Grace found herself caring less about his past and more about the immediate future. Thomas needed feeding. Sam needed doctoring. Questions could wait. She cleaned Sam's bullet wound by lamplight, while Thomas slept against her chest. The stranger's hands looked too soft for outlaw work, his speech too refined for someone claiming to live rough. Something wasn't adding up, but the baby's steady breathing against her heartbeat made logic seem less important. That first night, Grace sat in her rocking chair with Thomas cradled in her arms, watching Sam's chest rise and fall in fevered sleep. For the first time since Henry died, the house felt alive again. Dangerous, maybe, complicated, certainly, but alive in ways she'd forgotten were possible. Thomas stirred, making soft baby sounds that reached places in Grace's heart she'd thought were sealed forever. She began humming an old lullaby, her voice rusty from disuse, but growing stronger with each note. Whatever Sam Turner was running from would catch up eventually. Men like him always carried trouble in their wake. But right now, in this moment, Grace had something worth protecting again. Something worth the risk of whatever storm was coming. And storms, she'd learned, had a way of changing everything. Days blended together like watercolors in rain. Grace found herself waking before dawn, not from habit anymore, but from anticipation. Thomas had learned her schedule faster than any farm animal ever did. His soft coos from the makeshift crib beside her bed pulled her from sleep more gently than any rooster's crow. Sam recovered slower than molasses in January, which gave Grace time to study him. Really study him. The man claimed to be an outlaw, but his table manners belonged in a preacher's parlor. He said please and thank you like his mama had beaten politeness into him with a wooden spoon. When he thought she wasn't looking, he'd rock Thomas with a tenderness that made her chest tight. "You're mighty gentle for a bank robber," Grace mentioned one morning, watching Sam feed Thomas with the patience of a saint. Sam's hand froze halfway to the baby's mouth. "Sarah always said I was too soft for the life we chose." That was another thing. Every time Grace asked about his past, Sam's answers came wrapped in dead wife stories. Convenient, really. Dead people couldn't contradict a man's version of events. But here's the weird part. Grace found herself caring less about his lies and more about the way he fixed her broken porch step without being asked. The way he knew exactly how to calm Thomas when colic hit. The way he looked at her across the dinner table like she was something worth staying for. 3 weeks into their strange arrangement, Grace discovered something that changed everything. She'd been washing Sam's shirts when a piece of metal fell from his pocket with a distinctive thud. Not coins. Heavier than that. Her hands shook as she picked up the sheriff's badge. Well-worn brass caught lamplight like an accusation. "Samuel Turner," it read. "Millbrook County Sheriff." Makes sense, right? The soft hands. The educated speech. The way he flinched whenever she mentioned turning him in to local law. Hard to report someone to authorities when you are the authorities. Grace stood in her kitchen holding that badge, listening to Sam's laughter drift in from the porch, where he was entertaining Thomas with silly faces. A sheriff, not an outlaw. A lawman who'd lied to her for weeks. She could have confronted him right then. Should have, maybe. Instead, she slipped the badge back into his pocket and pretended ignorance for 3 more days. Sometimes, truth needed its own timeline. When she finally cornered him, Thomas was napping peacefully in his basket. Sam sat at her kitchen table, looking stronger than he had since arriving. His color had returned. The wound had healed clean. Soon, he'd be well enough to leave. "Sheriff Samuel Turner," Grace said quietly, setting the badge on the table between them. "Millbrook County." Sam's face went white as fresh snow. He reached for the badge with trembling fingers, then looked up at Grace with eyes full of something that might have been relief. "How long have you known?" "Long enough." Grace sat across from him. Same spot she'd taken meals alone for months before his arrival. "The question isn't what you are. It's why you're running from it." The truth came pouring out like water through a broken dam. Sam had been tracking a gang of killers who'd murdered an entire Homestead family outside Millbrook. Everyone except baby Thomas, who'd been hidden in a root cellar during the massacre. The gang was led by Marcus Webb, Sam's former deputy. A man who'd worn a badge beside Sam for 2 years, before greed turned him into something else entirely. "They know Thomas survived," Sam explained, his voice barely above a whisper. "Figure when he gets older, he might remember faces, voices, can't have loose ends walking around." Grace looked at the sleeping baby, so innocent and unaware that grown men wanted him dead for crimes he'd never understand. "So you took him and ran. Wasn't supposed to last this long. Had backup plans, safe houses. But Webb knows how I think. Knows every contact I've got in law enforcement." Sam's hands clenched into fists. "Every place I tried to hide Thomas, they found us. Until here." "Why didn't you tell me the truth from the beginning?" Sam's laugh held no humor. "Would you have helped a sheriff being hunted by his own kind? Or would you have figured I'd gone bad too? Fair point. Trust was a luxury neither of them could afford to waste on strangers. But they weren't strangers anymore, were they? 3 weeks of shared meals and midnight feedings had created something neither of them expected. "I should turn you in," Grace said, but her voice carried no conviction. "You should," Sam agreed. "Would be the smart thing." They stared at each other across the table while Thomas slept between them, tiny chest rising and falling with perfect rhythm. The baby had no idea his existence had turned two broken people into something resembling a family. Then there was the matter of Grace's heart, which had started beating in patterns she'd forgotten were possible. Sam made coffee the way Henry used to. He hummed while doing dishes. He'd catch her looking at him sometimes, and smile like he was glad to be caught. "They're still coming, aren't they?" Grace asked. "Webb won't quit. He's got too much to lose now." Sam reached across the table, his fingers brushing hers. "I can take Thomas and leave tonight. You've done enough. More than enough." Grace looked down at their joined hands, then at Thomas sleeping peacefully in his basket. 3 weeks ago, she'd been setting one plate for dinner. Now the thought of going back to that silence felt like drowning. "What if I don't want you to go?" The question hung between them like morning mist, fragile and full of possibility. Sam's fingers tightened around hers. "Grace, I can't promise." "I'm not asking for promises." She stood up, still holding his hand. "I'm asking for truth. Do you want to stay?" Sam stood too, close enough that she could see gold flecks in his brown eyes, close enough to count his heartbeats if she tried. "More than I've ever wanted anything," he whispered. That's when Thomas chose to wake up, fussing softly in his basket, like he knew important decisions were being made without his input. Grace picked him up, settling him against her shoulder, while Sam watched with an expression that made her knees weak. They'd become a family by accident. Now they were choosing to become one on purpose. But Webb and his gang were still out there, getting closer every day. And sometimes the most dangerous part of loving someone was admitting you had something left to lose. The wind picked up outside, rattling windows like a warning. Sam moved to check the locks, while Grace hummed Thomas back to sleep. Neither of them mentioned the sound of distant hoofbeats that might have been imagination, or the way Sam's hand moved instinctively toward where his gun hung. Webb's voice carried across the farmyard like death itself calling roll. "Turner, know you're in there with the kid. Come out peaceful, and maybe the woman lives." Grace felt Thomas stiffen against her chest. Even babies could sense when evil came knocking. Sam pressed his eye to the window crack, counting shadows moving between the barn and chicken coop. 5 men, maybe 6, all armed, all patient as vultures. "Back door leads to the root cellar," Grace whispered. "Could get Thomas out that way." Sam shook his head. "Webb's too smart. He'll have men covering every exit." His fingers traced Thomas's tiny cheek. "Besides, running just means doing this again somewhere else." The first bullet shattered her kitchen window. Glass exploded inward, like deadly rain. Grace dove behind the overturned table Sam had positioned as cover, clutching Thomas tight enough to feel his heartbeat against hers. Fast little rabbit kicks that reminded her how much life she was fighting for. Then there was the matter of staying alive long enough to matter. Sam's revolver barked twice through the broken window. Someone screamed outside. Good. Grace had never wished harm on another soul before, but these weren't souls anymore. They were monsters wearing human faces, coming to murder a baby who couldn't even crawl yet. "Grace!" Sam's voice cut through the gunfire. "See that shotgun by the door? Can you reach it?" Could she reach it? 3 weeks ago, she'd been afraid to go outside after dark. Now she was army crawling across her own floor, while bullets punched holes in her walls. Funny how fast a person could change when someone they loved needed protecting. The shotgun felt heavier than expected. Henry had taught her to shoot rabbits years back, but rabbits didn't shoot back. Her hands shook so hard she nearly dropped the shells twice before getting them loaded. Another window exploded, Webb's men were getting braver, moving closer to the house. Sam fired steadily, but his face had gone pale again. The old wound was bleeding through his shirt. At this rate, he'd pass out before the ammunition ran low. That's when Grace made a decision that would have terrified her old self. She stood up, aimed the shotgun through the broken window, and pulled both triggers at once. The kick knocked her backward 3 steps. Outside, a man howled like a wounded coyote. Webb started cursing in ways that would make a preacher faint. "Nice shot," Sam grinned, blood seeping between his teeth. Grace reloaded faster this time. Amazing how quickly you could learn new skills when your family's life depended on it. Because that's what they were now, wasn't it? Family. Not by blood or marriage, but by choice. By bullets and broken glass. And a baby who needed them both. The front door splintered under someone's boot. Webb stepped through like he owned the place. Tall, lean, with dead eyes that had seen too much killing. His badge glinted on his vest, still wearing it like some sick joke. "Awful nice setup you got here, Turner." Webb's gun pointed straight at Thomas. Cozy little family. Be ashamed to break it up. Grace raised her shotgun before thinking twice. "Don't you dare!" Webb's laugh sounded like breaking bones. "Lady's got spirit. Too bad she picked the wrong side." His finger tightened on the trigger. Grace pulled both barrels without hesitation. Webb crumpled like a broken doll. The silence that followed felt heavier than all the gunfire combined. Grace stood over his body, smoking shotgun barrels still aimed at where his heart used to be. She'd crossed a line she never imagined crossing, and the strangest part was how right it felt. The surviving gang members scattered like roaches when the lights came on. Cowards, all of them, following a dead man's orders until the dying got too close to home. Sam collapsed against the wall, clutching his reopened wound. But he was smiling. Thomas had slept through the whole final exchange, peaceful as Sunday morning in his makeshift fortress of overturned furniture and spent shell casings. Grace looked at her destroyed kitchen, then at the 2 most important people in her world. Funny how home had nothing to do with walls and windows after all. The sound of approaching horses meant backup was finally arriving. But the real rescue had already happened. They'd saved each other. 2 hours later, I watched Sam's chest rise and fall in steady rhythm, while the town doctor finished stitching his wounds. Real lawmen had arrived with the sunrise, cleaning up Webb's body and taking statements nobody would probably read twice. Justice looked messier in real life than it did in Sunday sermons. Thomas gurgled happily in my arms, completely unaware he'd just survived his second massacre before learning to walk. Babies were lucky that way. No memory for the bad parts, just endless capacity for trusting the next day would be better. "Doc says I'll live," Sam announced, wincing as he sat up. His voice carried that particular brand of exhaustion that comes from bleeding too much and sleeping too little. "Might have a permanent limp, but I'll live." I shifted Thomas to my other hip. 3 months of caring for this child had made me stronger than I'd been since Henry died. Funny how protecting someone else could heal your own broken pieces. "What happens now?" Sam's fingers found mine across the space between us. Still warm, still steady, despite everything. "Sheriff's office in Millbrook wants me back. Said they'd set up a position where I could work mostly from home." He paused, studying my face like he was memorizing it. "Course, that depends on where home is." The question hung between us, like morning mist over wheat fields. Outside, my chickens were probably wondering why their breakfast was late. Life kept moving forward, whether you were ready or not. "Thomas needs a mother," I said quietly. "He's got one." Sam's thumb traced circles on my knuckles. "Question is whether she wants him to have a father too." I looked down at the baby who'd wandered into my life during a thunderstorm, bringing chaos and purpose in equal measure. His tiny fingers wrapped around my thumb with absolute trust. 6 months ago, I'd been setting one plate for dinner, talking to chickens like they cared about my loneliness. Now I had bullet holes in my kitchen walls, and bloodstains on my floorboards. I'd killed a man to protect my family. My family. 2 words that changed everything. "Reckon we'll need 3 plates from now on," I said. Sam's smile could have powered the whole county. "Reckon we will." Thomas chose that moment to reach for Sam with both hands, babbling something that sounded almost like Papa. Not his first word, but close enough to count. Some families were born. Others were forged in gunfire and sealed with love. Both kinds worked just fine.